All right, my babies. Hi. Look at this. I got me a new mic. Yay. Well, I didn't get it specifically for this podcast or these videos. I don't know what the fuck to call these. I got them for, I think this, perfection. I got it because we're doing an exercise where we're creating content on the basis of what exactly we're doing and how we're thinking. So it's not just me and another person, or me and the person I work with in my company. So so this kind of like catches both our conversation, I guess. We tried the normal speaker once when we were having a discussion. It did not really work. So we're trying this one. Fuck yeah. Now, for today's video, it's an interesting one. I'm sure whoever watches this knows by now that I'm into anime, and one of the mangas that I read is called That Time I Got Reincarnated as a Slime. So here we go. Maybe we'll go mad, but it just might reforge our spirits. And so, okay, it's hitting hard. Maybe we'll go mad, but it just might reforge our spirits. The conversation is around the dungeon, because the dungeon is a hell to be challenged again and again, so the weak-willed will gain some strength. You know, every time I think about the dungeon, what I imagine is darkness, and I imagine kind of like a loss of touch with the world, right? And any way you look at it, the truth behind it is, or any way I look at it, it's a mental thing. Everyone talks about your shadow, your darkness. I mean, all the things that kind of like are not really a representation of you. But I feel that's a fallacy. Because the most honest thing these parts of you do, and again, like I use the term shadow in a very, like my theory is we're born with the shadow with us. Like in the darkness, the shadow wraps around us and protects us. And in the light, it stands in the opposite direction to make sure whatever kind of like, because anytime you're under the light or in the sun's light, you kind of like do stuff. And when I mean do stuff, you explore stuff, you add stuff to your mind, you add stuff to your vision, you add stuff to your day, you add stuff to your existence. And what fucking supports that? Because the stronger the sun, the more refined the shadow is, right? And the more vague the sun is, the more like scattered the shadow. And there's no definition of the actual like where you start and where you finish. So for me, it's I feel our mind is basically the dungeon to be challenged. What we end up doing is, okay, so here's the thing. What happens in a dungeon? Well, you don't really see the sun for enough time, which is exactly the same theory that happens in a cave. By the way, like there's a video somewhere about dungeon sickness, which is that. But the idea is basically you go in and you kind of like lose track of things, and you kind of like are anxious to leave, and you're anxious to finish, and you're anxious to do what you have to do. And by doing that, you kind of like neglect yourself. You neglect your sleeping patterns because it changes, right? Like now you're sleeping differently. You neglect rest, you neglect eating, you neglect basically, you stop being as careful as you are simply because like you're kind of like jumping into it. You want to get away with it. You want to get over it. And all of these kind of like build on top of each other and add anxiety and stress. And ultimately, the more anxiety and stress you get, the more you kind of like are losing yourself in the process. Bahjat. Okay. You're losing yourself in the شو اسمه, in the process. You're losing you're losing touch with the original reality that you started with. And let's just say, like, our reality is basically designed by the world outside of us. So, like, if you leave the house every day, you see the world a certain kind of way. If you don't leave the house for a couple of weeks, when you leave the house, you kind of like look at the world and you're like, it feels different. It feels different because you're interacting with it with a bit more, less experience that you normally would. Now, again, like, there's double sides of it, right? Because ultimately, every single time you leave the house or you're in the world kind of like sucks you in and like takes you into its drama. But the same happens when you enter your mind, because your mind's gonna take you around, explore the things that you've left behind or the things that kind of like need your attention. And that kind of like, and sometimes they don't really get resolved, right? You have to be okay, like going back out into the world without resolving something in hopes of different information, inspiration, or just faith and trust in that it will resolve itself, because who the fuck knows where we came from. So the idea is, in the time I got reincarnated as a slime, she talks about basically how the dungeon is a hell to be challenged. And I feel that's also a reference to you challenging your perception of yourself in your own head, because that's how you project yourself to the world. Again and again, so the weak-willed will gain some strength. Because ultimately, like, avoiding the thoughts of your head break you. And avoiding the thoughts of your head are kind of like an exploration of how your will is not really like, because you need to dive in and you need to see them and you need to accept them and you need to like move forward from there. So maybe we will go mad, but it just might reforge our spirit. And this is basically huge. Why? Because like our entirety is built around that spirit. And we're not saying spirit in terms of the spirit of God or any of that shit. I mean, like, whatever. We're saying spirit as in like, our the energy we kind of like we give out to the world, the energy we kind of like express through our intention, through our actions. It's just more of the movements, the steps we take, the way we approach things. That is our spirit. And right, there are people who, as they approach things, you can't tell them no. And there are people that it doesn't matter how hard you show them that it's easy or simple, they just can't say yes. And like, that's the difference between the intensity of like a strong spirit, strong-willed individual versus somebody who's not really like, who's weak-willed and weak-spirited, right? Now, will and spirit are two separate things. But again, like, all the context makes more sense. Because the weakest of people are the strongest when the time comes for them to kind of like when the time comes for them to act. And the strongest of people are probably like sometimes cave under pressure, right? And we all have these parts of us that need that attention. And ultimately, they start kind of either poisoning themselves or not. So maybe we'll go mad, but it just might reforge our spirit. Like, actually diving into our mind. There's no need to accept that our mind is the way it is and that's it. Because it says nothing about who we are. It absolutely doesn't. I promise you. I promise you out of experience. I promise you out of just negotiation with myself. I have voice notes beyond voice notes, over 500 voice notes, 10, 20, 30 minutes sometimes each, where I am feeling stuff around thoughts that are happening in my mind, and they're not really my thoughts because I don't know where they came from. And the first thing you do is start suspecting yourself, and then suddenly you kind of realize that you're having these thoughts because you're consuming a lot more than you can handle. So your brain is taking the highlights of it. And if you're consuming a lot more, for example, drama destruction, you're going to start feeling more fear or more murderous or more aggressive or more just overall like pissy. And if you're consuming a lot more spirituality, your ego's going to take that side, or you're going to be a lot more nonchalant or more whatever, like all that kind of like, I don't know, like, you know, trying to teach freedom to to somebody in a fucking like cage, something in a cage, whatever. But the idea is that if we're going to look at the dungeon as a hell to be challenged again and again, so the weak-willed gain some strength, and then ultimately, like, entering our mind and challenging our thoughts, whatever people might call demons, right? Because they kind of like build characteristics and identities around them, which you normally would reject, because you reject a world. Your reality needs to be exactly how it should have you safe within it, right? Your reality is in your head. It's not the shared world. And so maybe challenging your reality every once in a while is definitely something that allows you to reforge your will without you actually like taking action towards that. But every single time you challenge something that exists within your reality, what happens is you change. And that's the relationship that kind of like adjusts. And the minute that relationship adjusts because of that challenge, because of that trial you put it under, right? It's the same thing with, like, you know, considering you go into a dungeon, what you're doing is you're fighting monsters. You're adventuring, you're fighting monsters, you're spending time there, you're exhausting yourself. You come with supplies, you come with plans, you come with itineraries and preparations, and then basically you do what you have to do, and either you come from the other side victorious or you go back to challenge it again and again and again, and eventually you reach the final level or you explore the last level and you like open up to the world and blah 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 blah. And there's not just one dungeon, is there, right? Because your mind gets reforged with every level that you actually reach. Your mind creates a new dungeon. And the more time you take to not explore it, the more it grows inside of your head, and eventually you find yourself kind of like, all right, I have to go and I have to do something, or else I'm okay staying where I am. It's interesting. I'm looking at it from an interesting way. Fuck yeah, man. It's a video. I love you guys, as always. You guys are perfect. And yay, new mic. Woohoo!